Hello and welcome to the second half of the American Literature Survey course, which covers works published from the Civil War to the contemporary period. This is 150 years of literature. We'll begin the course by looking at realism and various literary modes that emerge in the late 19th century. Writers during this era were invested in an attempt to make imaginative literature more realistic. In the first of two video segments for Unit 1, we'll take a look at Mark Twain's essay, Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses, and then we'll apply his ideas to two short stories. Those stories are Pauline Hopkins' A Dash for Liberty and William Dean Howells' Editha. First, let's review a few things about realism, which you might remember from the introduction to Volume C. Realism becomes the predominant literary mode in the later half of the 19th century. The Civil War had changed the way Americans viewed the world. Remember, this is an age when photography becomes much more available, and images of battlefields and dead soldiers were familiar to large audiences. The ideals of Romanticism begin to ring false in this age. We'll see a similar response to World War I later in our readings. The meaning of the term realism is complicated by the fact that, as the introduction in our anthology suggests, there were different versions of realism. We have a variety of categories associated with this mode. We have regionalism, local color writing, and naturalism, which at the turn of the century was often termed new realism. Another complication arises because of the variety of autobiographical works written by African, Native Americans, and other immigrants at this time. We might easily argue that these works form a separate tradition, while at the same time begin to look at the ways they intersect with such categories as realism or regionalism. So realism, for our purposes, is a literary movement. And as such, it should not be confused with reality. Instead, think of literary realism as a set of conventions that the writers in this mode use. In American literary history, realism reaches its height around the turn of the 20th century. At its core, realism asks, what is real? American literary realism begins as a mode of perception, a way of seeing the world, and a way of representing that way of seeing. It also becomes a way of thinking about American life. All writers in realistic modes share a commitment to referential narrative. This is true despite evidence in the works of invention. Writers of this time period are trying to represent what is happening out there in the world. In addition, they believe that art has the power to represent realistically what is happening. Okay, so let's start with a brief look at Mark Twain's, who is an early practitioner of realism. His essay, Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses, will help us tease out some of the characteristics associated with realism. Twain's commentary on Fenimore Cooper, and I'm going to stumble on that name, and on romantic fiction in general is supposed to be funny, and I hope you found it so. This essay is as close as Twain gets to offering a statement about realism. In his version, realism is a reactive mode. In other words, it is a way of writing that rejects the illusions, sentimentality, fantasy, and invention of Romanticism. We are not reading this Missouri writer's most famous work, Huckleberry Finn, but we can see this novel, like the essay, as a response to the impact of romantic and sentimental fiction on the world. James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, I'm going to give you a little background first, were extremely popular with generations of readers for their portrayal of life in colonial America. And you may have read an excerpt from some of his novels in the first half of the American Literature Survey. His protagonist, Natty Bumppo, is an Anglo-American hunter and woodsman whose survival skills are presumably based on Native American practices. He's obviously a superhero, someone who can shoot a target in extreme conditions, while barreling down the river in rapids, in the dark, blindfolded. Okay, not blindfolded, but you get my meaning. His abilities are beyond that of most humans. And this is what Twain objects to. Fenimore Cooper's literary offenses are those elements of his novels that are not based in objective reality. Twain observes that Fenimore Cooper violated 18 of the 19 rules governing literary art. And you have to remember that Twain himself is responsible for coming up with these rules. They're not really established. A number of these rules have to do with the representation of people. Twain insists on ordinary and realistic dialogue in rule number 5, which you can read on page 326. He writes that the rules of literature require that when the personages of a tale deal in conversation, the talk shall sound like human talk. Characters, according to Twain in rule number 9, which is on page 327, also, he writes, shall confine themselves to possibilities and let miracles alone. Or if they venture a miracle, the author must so plausibly set it forth as to make it look possible and reasonable. Setting for Twain also needs to be based in objective reality. He calls out Fenimore Cooper for putting a 16 by 140-foot boat into a river which could not have possibly accommodated that size, writing, and you can find this on page 329, this Leviathan had been prowling down bends which were but a third as long as itself, and scraping between banks where it had only 2 feet of space to spare on each side. We cannot too much admire this miracle. For Twain, the Leatherstocking Tales offer no seeming of reality. Its characters are confusedly drawn. Its conversations are, indescribable. Its love scenes odious. Its English a crime against the language. And you can find that quote on the last page, which is 334. The criteria that Twain identifies in critiquing Fenimore Cooper mirror those elements featured in realism. Writers in realist modes do a number of things. First, they introduce characters who resemble ordinary people in ordinary circumstances, many of whom meet unhappy ends. The pattern of the unhappy ending is much less prevalent in regionalism. There's much more emphasis on the unhappy in realism, as if it is somehow more real. We still have vestiges of this thinking today. Think about contemporary memoir, and we'll read that towards the end of the semester. They are almost always dark and feature an individual trying to overcome hard times, drug addiction and addictions of other sorts, abuse, death, illness. We tend to associate reality with grittiness. In addition to realistic characters, writers of realism tend to develop their characters by use of ordinary speech and dialogue. Some writers make use of orthographic changes to convey particular speech rhythms and other elements of dialect peculiar to regional life. Some writers will use, for example, the spelling W-E-Z for was. Interestingly, these are pronounced exactly the same, but the different spelling suggests other personal characteristics about the speaker, a lack of education, for example, or low economic status. Third, writers of realism set their fictions in places that actually exist, or might easily have actual prototypes. Setting can become conspicuous as an element of theme in local color in regionalist fiction. Fourth, writers of realism are interested in recent or contemporary life, not in history or legend. And fifth, these stories rely on first or third person limited point of view to convey the sensibility of a central character, or in the case of local color writers, it represents the altered perception of the outside observer as he or she witnesses the unique scene. Okay, I want to turn our attention to William Howells' Editha. Like Twain's essay, this story makes an argument for realism in literature. Although we don't read Howells' work very much in today's classrooms, he was instrumental as both a writer and an editor in promoting realism at the turn of the century. He is famous for saying, "The only reason for the existence of a novel is that it does attempt to represent life." The author headnote in our anthology is useful in our investigation of realism in that it reviews his particular ideas about realism. For Howell, realism was nothing more or less than the truthful treatment of material, especially with regards to the motives and actions of ordinary men and women. Howells also saw realism as a political mode. In other words, for Howells, realism was a way to explore social and economic injustice, and this is important. As an editor, he promoted writers of color, immigrants, and women, allowing a space for the development of literature written from the margins. We might say Howells elaborates Twain's #1 rule, which you can find on page 326, that a tale shall accomplish something and arrive somewhere. Howells' Editha has a purpose. Through his story, he attempts to change our perception and to challenge yellow journalism. And I'll talk about yellow journalism in a little bit. In particular, Howells' story is a critique of both war propaganda and literary romanticism. Through Editha, Howells attempts to show that literary realism is a better and more accurate representation of the world. And more important, it is also a more ethical literary mode. Editha's romantic worldview has been shaped by the yellow journalism that drummed up popular support for the Spanish-American War. He satires the romantic conception of battlefield glory that appeared in yellow journalism of the time. Yellow journalism is a type of journalism that presents little or no legitimate, well-researched news and instead uses eye-catching headlines to sell more newspapers. We still have a kind of yellow journalism today. Techniques may include exaggerations of news events, scandal-mongering, and sensationalism. Historians today point to the Spanish-American War as the first media-driven war. There's an apocryphal story about journalist, photographer Frederick Remington covering the war for newspapers owned by Randolph Hearst. After arriving in Cuba, Remington telegrammed, "Everything is quiet. There's no trouble here. There will be no war. I wish to return." Hearst quickly telegrammed back, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." The story is very likely not true, but it does convey a noted problem with yellow journalism, its manipulation of truth. For our purposes, we will look at the story of Editha as a study in the differences between the literary modes of realism and romanticism. The title character, Editha, is a mouthpiece for the romantic and sentimental literature that, according to Howells, glossed over the realities of human experience. We see that she lives in the ideal rather than the real. Her response that war has broken out is, "How glorious." Editha has been socialized into notions about what is honorable and what is worthy. This is highlighted in those passages where she does one thing, but upon further thought, she changes course. One example is where she describes her declaration of love for George. Her instinct is to return his love immediately, but then she changes her mind when she remembers from her reading that a man is supposed to do something great or glorious to win a woman's love. There are other phrases that reveal Editha's indebtedness to a romantic and sentimental worldview. When she utters them, Howells responds by undermining or exposing her sentimentality. For example, she tells George, "I'm yours for time and eternity, time and eternity." Howells calls attention to the emptiness of her declaration when he writes in the next sentence, "She liked these words. They satisfied her famine for phrases." Another example appears on page 383. Following the news of George's death is wording right out of sentimental fiction. Howells again undercuts the sentiment and suggests that Editha isn't really feeling these feelings, but just mimicking what she has read in a novel. Editha is not just an unrealistic spectator of the world around her. Her thinking leads to tragedy. She uses George's love against him and manipulates him into going to war, lest he lose her. In her letter to him, she repeats a pair of lines from Richard Lovelace's 17th century poem, Lucasta Going to the Wars. Her message is clear. Going to war will be proof of his love for her. In addition to idealizing and romanticizing her relationship with George, Editha also has an unrealistic sense of the events unfolding in the Spanish-American War. On page 378, for example, she attributes the war to God. Howells, however, reveals that her beliefs have no substance and attributes them to a slavish adherence to the opinions in the pro-war yellow press. He tells us on page 377, she was conscious of parroting the current phrases of the newspapers. Here, Howells draws a parallel between literary romanticism and yellow journalism. They both rely on emotions and ideas rather than on facts and the world as it is, and they mislead people, which results in their death. When George reluctantly goes to war, he comments, and you can find this on page 380, "I'm going to war, the big war, the glorious war, the holy war ordained by pocked providence that blesses butchery." Notice the effect of Howells' description of the war. He uses a series of escalating descriptions to emphasize the irony in his praise. In this way, Howells criticizes religion, or rather the abuse of religion, used to support a man-made conflict and not one ordained by God. Howell presents realism as an alternative to yellow journalism and sentimentality. We don't see the war itself, but we have attention to the aftermath and its effect on families and communities. This gets played out in scenes with George's mother. Editha is the voice of idealized romanticism. That's clear. As such, we might assume that Howells is gendering romanticism. Indeed, the sentimental and other romantic traditions are often associated with women writers. And on page 379, Editha herself espouses domestic ideology promoted by progressive women writers earlier in the century. She believes that women privately and subtly influence men through the domestic realm rather than in the sphere of politics. It is her nature pulling upon his nature, she says, her womanhood upon his manhood, and that's what will influence him. Howells seems to associate romantic, sentimental thinking with women, but the story complicates this reading through the character of George's mother. In contrast to Editha, she makes anti-war statements, very strong ones. Editha's mother also tells her daughter that she had hoped George wouldn't go to the war. With the introduction of these other female characters, we might argue that Howells does not argue that all women are romantic idealists like Editha, who are susceptible to the propaganda of media. His focus instead is on the negative attributes of media and literature. Okay, we have one more story to discuss. Pauline Hopkins, A Dash for Liberty. She takes a slightly different stance toward romantic literary traditions and their relationship and or relevance to realism. Published in 1901, this is 6 years after Twain's essay, Hopkins' story provides a test case for defining literary realism at the end of the 19th century. Hopkins seems a likely realist. She was a journalist who reported on contemporary events. The subject matter of her story also comes from history. It is based on an actual occurrence, an uprising in 1841 that occurred on the Creole, which was a slave ship. Let me read a little bit to convey Hopkins' style. At the bottom of page 730, Madison describes to his white employer the situation of a fugitive slave who has left an enslaved wife behind. Imagine yourself in my place. How would you feel? The relentless heel of oppression in the States will have ground my rights as a husband into the dust and have driven Susan to despair in that time. A white man may take up arms to defend a bit of property, but a black man has no right to his wife, his liberty, or his life against his master. We can imagine what Twain would say about this speech. This does not sound like your typical black laborer living in 1841. Madison is a superhero, just like Natty Bumppo. You can practically see his cape billowing in the air as he stretches his arms toward the sky, backlit, of course, by the sun. He's a fugitive slave, and he's telling his employer, albeit one sympathetic to his plight, that, basically, and I'm going to paraphrase, you white people are all alike, you just can't understand us. Notice also that he doesn't sound like the other men who are from the same place as Madison, and you can look at that dialogue on page 732. I think we can see he's not your average black man living in the mid-19th century. Hopkins' characterization of Madison is arguably unrealistic, but by casting a fugitive slave as a superior being, Hopkins emphasizes his heroism, and more important, she challenges prevailing stereotypes based on race. In this way, Hopkins' story fulfills Twain's #1 rule, that a tale shall accomplish something and arrive somewhere. Hopkins has a purpose, and her story helps to change perception of America's black population, even as she fails in following the other rules set forth by Twain. Madison's amazing good looks and intelligence parallel the extreme beauty and talent of his wife. Susan is described as a great beauty who attracts attention. There are other women in the story, some even attractive, but Susan stands out among them. Twain would probably shake his head at the scene in which the captain attempts to sexually violate Susan. This scene is on pages 734 and 735. Hopkins introduces details to dramatize the scene, but these only reinforce unrealistic elements. Notice, for example, Susan's ninja moves. In less than a second, she goes from being fast asleep and fully prone on the floor to an upright defensive stance. And the captain sounds like a silent film villain. You can just imagine him twirling a dark mustache as he says, "None of that, my beauty. Why did you think you had a private cabin and all the delicacies of the season? Not to behave like a young catamount, I warrant you. Ah ha 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 ha." Okay, I added that sinister laugh, but you could just hear it in between those lines. Twain would also call out the unrealistic coincidence that has Madison arriving just as his wife escapes from the captain. And adding to the implausibility is his superhuman strength and aim. He rips a padlock in half, throws it, and hits the captain right in the head and knocks him out. He does all this while leading a slave rebellion. Notice how Hopkins echoes Patrick Henry's cry on page 735, "Give me liberty or give me death." Madison cries, "It is liberty or death." His act of heroism is parallel to the American Revolution, Hopkins suggests to us. Like our founding fathers, Madison is fighting for the inalienable right to liberty. Hopkins' story is not realistic in the sense that Twain would describe realism. Howells would also have been aware of the numerous romantic and melodramatic elements in A Dash for Liberty. But Hopkins is drawing attention to the dehumanization of slaves, while she highlights the plight of female slaves in particular. Sexual violence for them was a historical reality. Howells would have admired Hopkins' sense of social justice despite its unrealistic elements. In Hopkins' story, we see a tension between realistic content and romantic form. Remember, Romanticism makes an appeal to emotions and thus highlights an emotional context as opposed to an objective reality. In the mid-19th century, women writers found Romanticism, especially the tradition of sentimental fiction, to be a powerful tool in fighting against slavery and sexism. Think of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. So in closing, Hopkins reminds us that writers from marginalized groups often had to engage with realism in different ways from mainstream writers like Mark Twain and Howells. While trying to establish an African American literary perspective, and also a female perspective, Hopkins also had to develop a voice that could speak to a predominantly white reading public. And so to do so, she uses a style that is easily understood and relatable to that audience.